Portals are pretty cool, and today we'll be making a portal you see on your screen using Talos, which is a powerful real-time VFX tool. We'll create a neat shader for the inner background and add the rest using a node-based particle system to make it fancy. I have Talos already running, and by default it's in particle making view. But since we're starting with the background, let's choose a shader graph from the main menu and then click on a new shader to open a new workspace. Right-clicking on an empty space opens a node selector, and there are large amounts of them available. We'll probably have a separate tutorial on that. I'll be using the twirl node to make a circular distortion effect in the middle of our portal. You can see there is a preview of what the effect does at the bottom of the node, alongside with parameters we'll be configuring a bit later. Another node we may need is some sort of noise, either a Voronoi or just gradient noise. I personally prefer Voronoi for this case. To apply the distortion, all you need to do is connect the output of the twirl node to the UV input of the Voronoi node. There are a bunch of things you can configure here. I have some numbers that work well for this effect. The effect currently is very static, so if we want to animate it, we have to use the time node in order to do that. We're going to multiply time by 0.2 in order to make it slower, and we can change it later. And if you want to connect it to the offset value, you'll see this kind of cool animation going on here, which is perfect here for our effect. Currently our output texture is black and white, but we want it to be transparent and white based on its value. One way to do it is to use any of RG or B channels as alpha. I'm going to use color node to separate it into channels, and then a color mixer to mix it back together. And if you just want to put them side by side and connect the red channel to red, green to green, and blue to blue, then set transparency to full or the same, you will get the same image. But that's not what we want to do here. Instead, I'm going to disconnect that for a second and connect all of them to the red output. Most importantly, the alpha channel. See how it's different now? Next part is to mask it into something spherical. For that, we're going to use a sphere mask node, which looks like a sphere, and you can control hardness and other things. Or you could just use pre-baked texture here. And we're going to multiply them together to apply the mask. We also want to apply color to the texture, and for that, we can multiply it with a color node output. This is done simply by multiplication, but feel free to experiment with different math operations to get some intuition on how they look in preview. You can try a bunch of things, but multiplication is what you are usually and eventually looking for. And then we can just manipulate color to whatever we want it to be, which is quite a lot of fun. In this case, though, I'm just going to delete that and attach a vertex color node instead. It's going to look white for now, but this will actually give us a way to control color from the particle editor later on. At this point, we're kind of lacking in brightness, so a usual trick to just make things brighter is multiply that by 2 to elevate the values. Before exporting, the final color needs to end up in a pixel shader node, which is the output node for the shader. And we are done. I am going to set blending additive, which is usually what we use in our particle editor, so that we see how it's going to look. And yeah, this is kind of the whole graph for our shader. That's how it looks. And all we have to do is export the SHDR file and move back to the particle editor. On the left here, we have a list of emitters. These are sort of like layers. When making a particle effect, we always need to start with 2 nodes. One is emitter and the other is particle. Otherwise, you won't be seeing anything at all. I'm going to set the drawable, in this case, to shader sprite and open our SHDR file in it. And you can also just drop it. And what I usually do is open up the config part, just like that, to make effect continuous, so it always loops. We only need a few particles at a time and a shorter life, since the texture is already dynamic. As for size, a dynamic range module is good here, since not only I want to start small and grow over time, but it will also be nice to have some randomness and variety instead of fixed value. This should be okay. As you can see, it looks rather uneven and dull, since particles are spawning and dying without any transition, so I'm just going to add a curve to transparency in order to ensure a smooth transition from one particle to another. Yeah, something like that should do, yeah. Now, remember that vertex color we used in the shader? This enables us to use color properties of particles from the system, which will eventually end up as a vertex color, and apply to the effect. If we wouldn't have done that, changing color here wouldn't really have any effect on the shader. A particle effect here can have multiple emitters, and we can add some more stuff to it as well. That would be a glow ring to specify boundaries, and also, well, add some kind of flow of particles going to the center. Let's start with a glow effect. For this one, I'm going to use a texture that I made before in Photoshop. It's just a circle with some glow on it. I'll set the size to 4.5 using a number node, and for transparency, we're going to use a curve just like we did before. This also needs a smaller emission and a lifespan of 3 seconds or so. I like to move my nodes around so that lines don't intersect. It's just neat that way. And for color, let's just set it to light blue, and we'll fix the rest with transparency. Controlling this is important to avoid an overburn, but it depends on your texture, really. This should be the right value, I think. Last emitter here is going to be for that flow of particles from outside to middle, which is quite easy to achieve. Just going to rename the emitter and create the usual default modules. And a proper texture here would be some kind of circle point particle, since it will look right when we stretch it later. We're going to use my favorite module here, which is called a shape range, and it looks like a smiley face. It has a from and to shapes, and they can be square, ellipse, or line. Our goal is to make the particles appear on an edge of a circle. For that, I'm going to select the ellipse option. Let me make them just a bit smaller so we see them better. See? They look like small points appearing at the edge of our glow. Now, because I want them to appear in a range of a donut, I'll make the left circle slightly smaller and then pass emitter duration as an alpha variable to make sure randomness changes based on which particle is emitted. It's kind of a hack. I think something like 4.5 or around that should work fine. You also need to change the curve so it takes the alpha into account. And now they spawn in the shape of a donut. If we add some velocity to particles, they will all move upwards, but what we want them to do is to actually move to the center. For that, instead of modifying their angle of movement, we're going to pass a target point to where they will move. In this case, it's a vector value of 0, so they will move towards the center. Now to stimulate some motion blur. First of all, let's make them a bit pointy by providing different height and width values instead of one fixed size. So bigger width, smaller height. And then, just checking the aligned checkbox will make them all rotate in the direction of movement automatically. I'm just going to make them maybe a lot smaller and also provide some randomness so they all look different. Random range module will just output random values from the min and max range you provide. It's a pretty simple module. This already looks pretty cool. I'm just going to adjust some modules, fix transparency a bit, make it a curve, and maybe just slightly more transparent than that in the beginning. This looks good, I think. And then you can export this to use in your game or do some modifications, which are pretty easy to do when you've gone this far. You can change some colors or add new things like ribbons for particle trails, which will make it grow like it's some kind of healing nature-created portal. Or add a vector field, which will make it have this weird-looking wavy, like trails that swish around. I also have changed the main shader for this one, so it has slightly different background, but it's the same logic, with different values for the Voronoi and twirl. or just in general go crazy. There are so many things you can do by just changing values and adding some new emitters. In case you were interested, we'll be covering some new topics such as ribbons for particle trails, vector fields, and a lot more in future tutorials, so do subscribe and come back for more. Thank you for watching, and I hope to see you in the next tutorial.